The smile was the worst part. Not the bruises that had long since faded to memory. Not the cracked phone screen she'd taped together until she could afford a new one. Not the restraining order folded in her jacket pocket like a talisman she'd stopped believing in. Those things Mara Callahan had learned to carry the way a woman learns to carry anything heavy quietly, without complaint, with the particular economy of movement that came from years of making herself smaller. The smile she could not carry. The smile she had no armor against. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, through the plate glass window of the Ember Diner, at 6:47, when the breakfast rush was just beginning to build and Mara had 3 tables waiting and a carafe of coffee in each hand. She was halfway through a turn toward booth 4 when the movement across the street caught her peripheral vision the way danger always did, not with fanfare, not with warning, just with the sudden cold certainty of a body that had learned to identify threat before the mind caught up. Derek Hollis stood on the sidewalk opposite, arms folded, weight easy on his heels, like a man who had nowhere pressing to be and didn't care who knew it. He wore the gray jacket she'd bought him for his birthday 2 years ago, which felt, even now, like a specific cruelty. He was smiling, not at anyone passing by, not at the morning, at her, at the fact of her, visible through glass, unable to pretend she hadn't seen him. He wasn't crossing toward her, wasn't making a scene, wasn't doing anything that would show up on paper as a violation. He was simply standing there in the October morning like a man who had all the time in the world, making sure she saw him, making absolutely certain she understood. "I found you." Mara set the carafes down on the nearest surface before her hands could betray her. She breathed. One slow breath in, one controlled breath out, the way her therapist had taught her before the insurance ran out and the appointment stopped. She was still here. She was still standing. The diner was full of people who needed coffee and plates, and Derek Hollis was on the other side of a pane of glass. And she was still here. If you're already caught up in this story, hit that like button and subscribe. It takes 2 seconds, and it means the world to me. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let's get back to them. The Ember Diner existed in that particular stratum of the city that nobody wrote magazine features about. It occupied the ground floor of a building on Callaway Street that had been, in successive decades, a shoe repair shop, a laundrette, a pawn operation of dubious legality, and now this 12 tables, a counter with 8 stools, a kitchen that sent warmth and grease and the smell of bacon through every seam in the walls. The sign outside had lost the B in embers sometime last February, so it now read Ember Diner in faded red letters, which June, who worked the morning shift alongside Mara, said was somehow classier. June Nakamura had been working at the Ember for 11 years and knew everything about everyone within a 6-block radius, which she dispensed freely and without malice, the way a good priest might dispense benediction. She was 43, 5 feet tall in her thickest-soled shoes, and possessed of the kind of laugh that made strangers at the counter feel like they'd just been let in on a secret. She was the reason Mara had found the job in the first place through a handwritten card on a community bulletin board at the women's shelter on Draper Street. "Looking good, help? Ask inside." As hiring processes went, Mara had known worse. That had been 7 months ago. Mara had arrived with a duffel bag, a social security card, and a driver's license in a name Derek didn't know. She used a legal middle name she'd never taken publicly, Callahan instead of Hollis, her mother's maiden name reclaimed in a courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon while Derek was at work and believed she was grocery shopping. She'd been Mara Hollis for 3 years. She'd been nobody's wife and nobody's property for 7 months. And those 7 months were the first time since she was 24 years old that she'd slept without one ear aimed at the door. She'd come to the city from Crestdale, which was 240 miles northeast, and an entire universe removed, a place where everyone knew Derek's family, where his father was a county commissioner, where the police chief had gone to high school with his uncle, and where a woman with bruises and a restraining order application was quietly informed that these things were complicated, that families had their difficulties, that she might want to think carefully about the consequences of making accusations against a man whose family had built half the county's infrastructure and funded half its churches. Mara had thought carefully, and then she'd packed a bag at 4 in the morning on a Thursday while Derek slept off a fifth of bourbon, and she'd driven south until the tank was almost empty and the city skyline appeared on the horizon like a promise she was terrified to believe in. The shelter had given her 90 days. She'd used every one of them, learning the geography of her new city the way a person learns any new language slowly at first, with effort, and then with the accumulating fluency that came from necessity and repetition. She'd found June's card. She'd walked into the Ember on a rainy Wednesday and been given a uniform, a training shift, and a look from June that said, "I know something happened to you, and I'm not asking, and it won't change how I work with you." That look had been worth more than a month's salary. The work suited her in ways she hadn't anticipated. Mara had waitressed before Derek before the 3 years of his particular education in what a wife was supposed to be, and what a woman was owed, and how much space she was permitted to take up. She'd worked her way through 2 years of community college refilling coffees and carrying plates, had gotten good at reading tables the way some people read weather, gauging moods and hunger, and the particular restlessness of someone who'd been waiting too long. She slipped back into it the way you slip back into a language learned young imperfectly at first, with gaps and hesitations, and then with increasing fluency until the motions became invisible. The Ember paid $12 an hour plus tips. Mara had found a room in a boarding house on the east side of the neighborhood, run by a woman named Mrs. Papadakis who had 3 rules. Pay on time, no overnight guests, don't touch the orange marmalade on the 3rd shelf because it's mine. Mara had observed all 3. Her room was small and faced an alley, but the window locked from the inside and the front door had a deadbolt, and those were the only 2 features that had mattered when she'd chosen it. She'd built something in those 7 months. Small, careful, constructed from the materials at hand. Not a life, yet not in the sense of something expansive and lit from within, but a structure. Walls and a roof. A place to stand. She had people who knew her name and said it with warmth. She had a savings account with $412, which was more money than she'd personally controlled in 3 years. She had a routine and a window that locked and 7 months of sleep that was broken sometimes by ordinary sounds rather than by the particular silence that preceded violence. Until this morning. Until the smile through the plate glass, and the gray jacket, and the absolute ease in his posture that said he was not going anywhere. Mara had gone through the morning shift with the practiced competence of someone who'd survived harder things than fear. She'd taken orders and delivered plates and refilled coffees and laughed at June's commentary on the couple in booth 6, who were clearly on a first date and handling it with remarkable ineptitude. She'd done all of this with the steady efficiency of a woman who had learned, through long necessity, to keep the inside and the outside of herself in separate rooms to present a surface that showed only what she chose to show, and to manage everything else quietly and alone, out of sight. But she'd check the window every time she walked past it. Derek had stayed for 40 minutes, had smoked a cigarette, then another, had made no move to cross, had said nothing, had done nothing that would hold up in a courtroom as a violation. And then he'd walked away with the unhurried ease of a man who knew there was no rush, who'd already communicated everything he needed to, who'd be back. He would be back. She knew that the way she knew her own breathing. She told June at the end of the shift, in the kitchen while they changed out of their uniforms. Not everything. Mara had learned to calibrate disclosure the way you calibrate anything sharp, using only what was needed and no more. But enough. My ex found me. He was outside this morning. June had looked at her for a long moment with those dark, steady eyes that had seen 11 years of the neighborhood's particular spectrum of human difficulty. Does he know you work here? I don't know. He knows I'm in the area. He must have been watching. June had been quiet in the way that meant she was thinking rather than reacting, which was one of the things Mara valued most about her. Then she'd said, I'm going to tell Frank to add you to the camera alert list. If he comes inside, Frank will know before he gets to the counter. Frank was the manager. He was also 6'4" and weighed 260 pounds and had, on at least 2 separate occasions Mara had witnessed, removed people from the Ember with the efficient calm of a man for whom escalation was simply a necessary tool, deployed without drama and without residue. It wasn't a solution, but it was a measure. Mara had learned the difference. She spent the evening at Mrs. Papadakis's house, sitting on the edge of her bed with her back to the wall, reading the same paragraph of a library book 7 times without retaining a word. She did a mental inventory of the restraining orders terms 200 feet, no contact, no communication, a paper tiger in a county where the man it named had grown up knowing everyone who might have to enforce it. She thought about calling the police here, in the city, and then she thought about Crestdale, and she put the phone down. Derek Hollis was not the kind of man the law had been built to protect women from. He was the kind of man the law regarded with a certain professional courtesy that left women like Mara doing their own arithmetic, alone, with whatever numbers they had available. She slept at 2 in the morning, lightly, with one ear aimed at the door, the old habit restored as though it had never left. Roman Voss had not intended to become a regular at the Ember Diner. His associate Marco, who handled logistics for the East Side territory, had suggested it during a meeting that had run long and bloodless into the dinner hour. There's a place on Callaway, nothing much to look at, but the coffee's honest and the staff doesn't talk to strangers. Roman had filed this under useful and forgotten about it until a morning 6 weeks ago when a meeting in the neighborhood had ended early and he'd needed somewhere to think. He'd thought at the corner stool. He'd ordered coffee. He'd been left entirely alone. He'd been back 11 times since. The men who worked for Roman Voss were not men given to unnecessary speech in their employer's presence. But in his absence they talked, the way men do. And what they said about him in those conversations carried the particular weight of genuine assessment rather than flattery. That he was not cruel for its own sake. That he was precise in his expectations, in his consequences, in the specific, almost surgical quality of his attention when something required it. That he had built an operation across the East Side and the waterfront district that ran with the kind of quiet efficiency that made it nearly invisible to the people who should have been looking, and entirely legible to the people who needed to know it was there. That when he entered a room, something shifted in the air, not like weather exactly, more like the particular stillness that preceded weather, the moment before a storm when the birds go quiet and the leaves turn their silver undersides to the sky. What the men said less often, because it didn't fit the prevailing narrative and also because most of them hadn't been paying close enough attention to notice. Roman Voss tipped well. Not extravagantly, extravagance drew attention, and attention was the one luxury he never permitted himself, but consistently, deliberately, with the quiet acknowledgement that service work was real work and the people performing it were not furniture. He'd noticed Mara on his 3rd visit. Not the way certain men at the counter sometimes noticed her with that particular quality of attention that required her to become suddenly very busy and very unavailable. The occupational hazard of being young and female in a service environment where every man believed his gaze was a gift. He'd noticed her the way he noticed things that were slightly off-register. There had been a table of construction workers that morning, loud and expansive with the good cheer of men whose bodies were tired and whose spirits had not yet caught up, and one of them had said something to Mara as she set down their plates, nothing she hadn't heard before. The particular category of comment that lived in the gray zone between harmless and not, and she had smiled, said something light in return, and moved away with the economy of a person who knew exactly how much to give, and exactly when to withdraw. He'd watched her calibrate the interaction in real time. The precise measurement of warmth deployed and attention withheld. The small, practiced adjustments of her body language that said, "I see you, and you do not alarm me, and I am moving on now." It was the management of threat through competence, and Roman recognized it the way he recognized skill in any domain with a detached, professional appreciation. He'd filed her, and then he'd gone back to his coffee. By his 6th visit he knew her schedule. By his 9th he could read her mood from the particular set of her shoulders before she'd turned to face him. By his 11th he'd started to notice the window checking the small reflex she thought she was concealing, the half-second pause each time she passed the plate glass that faced Callaway Street, the way her eyes went there before she could stop them. He hadn't said anything. It wasn't his business. But he'd kept watching. June had worked out who he was on his 4th visit. Roman had known she'd worked it out by the slight recalibration of her manner, not afraid. More like the quiet adjustment of a woman who'd taken stock and decided her existing approach was adequate to the updated information. She'd been in this neighborhood long enough to know its geography, its power structures, the specific people who moved through it, and what their presence signified. She served him coffee and maintained exactly the right distance and asked him nothing, and he respected that enormously. Mara hadn't worked it out yet, or if she had, she'd filed it in the same category as the window, something to navigate around, not something to engage. She was polite and efficient and gave him the same clean, unperformative service she gave everyone at the counter, and he appreciated that most of all. Not afraid of him. Not performing ease to compensate for fear. Just present, professional, and giving him exactly what he'd asked for and nothing extra. He didn't know if her lack of fear came from not recognizing the threat he represented, or from having encountered worse threats so recently that he didn't register in comparison. He suspected the latter. He was at the counter on the Thursday when Derek Hollis came inside. Roman arrived at his customary time 7:15, which put him between the first wave and the second, a window of relative quiet that he'd come to value for the particular quality of its stillness. He took his corner stool. June brought his coffee without being asked and set a small plate of toast at his elbow, which she'd started doing on his 5th visit and which he'd started eating on his 6th without either of them acknowledging the arrangement. For other customers, a woman with a stroller nursing a tea at the window table. 2 older men in a booth engaged in the kind of argument that was really a conversation the newspaper spread between them like a treaty being negotiated. A delivery driver at the far end of the counter with his eyes on his phone. Normal. Quiet. The particular early morning truce that held before the day revealed what it intended to be. Mara was in the kitchen. He could hear her voice, something brief exchanged with the cook, a laugh that came and went, and then the service window swung open, and she came through with 2 plates for the booth, and she was halfway across the floor when the front door opened and Roman, who always looked at the door because looking at doors was as automatic to him as breathing, saw the man come in. Medium height, broad through the shoulders, the build of someone who'd been athletic once and maintained the frame without the conditioning. Conventional good looks, the kind that photographed well and read as charm from a distance, but revealed something harder up close. A gray jacket. He moved with the easy assurance of someone arriving somewhere he was welcome, and he scanned the room in the practiced way of a man accustomed to entering spaces and immediately locating what he'd come for. He found Mara. Roman watched her stop. It was barely a pause, a fraction of a second, a single missed beat in the continuity of her movement. The plates she was carrying didn't waver. Her expression didn't change. She completed the walk to the booth and set the food down with the same efficiency she brought to everything. But something had gone rigid beneath the surface, the way a river runs rigid in winter, still moving, still performing all the functions required of it, and frozen underneath. She turned back toward the kitchen. The man said her name. Mara. Not a greeting. Not a question. A statement. An assertion of knowledge and proximity and the right to deploy both, a single word that carried everything it needed to carry, which was this. I'm here, I found you, and I'm saying your name so you understand exactly what both of those things mean. She turned back slowly. Hey, Derek. Her voice was perfectly level. The steadiness of it was extraordinary. Roman recognized it as courage in the technical sense, not the absence of fear, but its management. The iron refusal to let what was happening on the inside translate to what the outside showed. You can't be in here. He smiled. The smile Roman had seen through the window on Tuesday, slow and satisfied. The expression of a man who'd spent enough time winning to forget that winning was conditional. I just want to talk. There's a restraining order. Her voice was still steady. 200 feet, those are just pieces of paper, Derek said. The lightness in his tone was practiced. The casualness of a man who'd learned that performing reasonableness while being unreasonable was its own kind of control. Come on, Mara. Don't make this a whole thing. He moved toward the counter, toward her, not rushing, not aggressive, just moving through space with the assumption that space would accommodate him, that it always had and therefore always would. June appeared from behind the service counter. She positioned herself in the gap between the counter and the nearest table with a precision that was small and quiet, and entirely deliberate. We're going to need you to leave, sir. Derek looked at her with the mild condescension of a man who'd never once been meaningfully deterred by a 5-foot woman. I'm here to talk to my wife. Ex-wife, Mara said. Her hands were at her sides, and they were not shaking. Roman set down his coffee cup. He did not stand. He did not raise his voice. He simply turned on his stool slowly, completely without hurry, with the particular quality of movement that belonged to people who had never once needed to rush to make a point, and he looked at Derek Hollis directly for the first time. It was the kind of look that required no explanation and generated no argument. Roman Voss had spent 20 years building the specific quality of attention that lived in his eyes when he chose to direct it at something, and it communicated, in the wordless language of consequence and permanence, a set of very precise and entirely accurate information. That the man now receiving it was visible, that the assessment being conducted had reached a conclusion, that the conclusion was not in the man's favor. Derek felt it. Roman watched him feel at the fractional interruption in his forward momentum, the involuntary realignment of his posture, the reflexive scan of Roman's face that was looking for something it could categorize and dismiss, and finding nothing it knew how to handle. "Everything all right?" Roman asked. Quiet. Not threatening. Not loud. Simply present in the room the way things that carry real weight are present without requiring announcement. Mara looked at him. It was brief, startled, recalibrating, a look that was trying to identify what had just changed in the room and why. Then she looked back at Derek. Derek had gone still. He was running the rapid background calculations that men like him ran when they encountered something they couldn't immediately measure: the gray jacket, the corner stool, the absolute stillness, the fact that June, who had spent 11 years navigating the full spectrum of this neighborhood's particular difficulties, was watching Roman with the expression of someone who understood the room had changed and intended to let it change. "I was just leaving," Derek said. The lightness in his voice was manufactured now. It hadn't disappeared entirely, he was too practiced for that, but it was constructed rather than natural. Roman heard the difference. Roman had spent 20 years learning the difference between the voice of a man who was genuinely unafraid and the voice of a man who needed other people to believe he was. The front door opened and closed. The diner held a breath. The woman with the stroller, who had been examining her tea with great concentration, exhaled. The two older men returned to their newspaper. The delivery driver kept scrolling. Mara had not moved. Roman picked up his coffee and took a sip. He didn't look at her. He looked at the door, then at the window facing the street. Then, after a moment, back at his toast. Methodical, unhurried, as if the last 3 minutes had been a minor interruption in an otherwise unremarkable morning. "You all right?" June said softly, from somewhere close to Mara's shoulder. Mara's hands were still at her sides. "Fine," she said, and then she went back to work. Roman ate his toast. He watched the plate glass window without appearing to watch it, and saw Derek's gray jacket move past on the sidewalk, not hurrying. Because men like that never hurried. Because hurrying would concede something they were constitutionally incapable of conceding and then disappear from view. He stayed past his usual time. He stayed while the late morning rush arrived, and the diner filled with sound and motion and the ordinary noise of people who had no part in what had just happened. He watched Mara move through her work, and he watched the way she moved differently now than she had 40 minutes ago, the slight elevation of tension across her shoulders, the way the window checking had increased rather than decreased, the small continuous expenditure of energy that was the price of sustained alertness. He knew what sustained alertness cost. He demanded it of his own people for years. He knew what happened to people who had to maintain it too long without support, what the erosion looked like, where it led. When he finally left, he laid the exact amount of his bill on the counter and added another 20 beneath the coffee cup, positioned so it wouldn't be immediately visible. Not a gesture toward her specifically, just arithmetic. He'd occupied a corner stool for 2 hours during a shift that had included a confrontation with a man who terrified her, and that had a value he was capable of acknowledging without anyone needing to discuss it. He walked out into the October morning. The street was ordinary. Foot traffic, a delivery truck double parked, a woman in a bright yellow coat walking fast with headphones in. Derek Hollis was not visible. Roman stood outside the door for a moment and looked both ways with the unhurried attention of a man who was never not taking inventory. Then he took out his phone and made one call. "Marco," he said when it connected. "Derek Hollis. Came into the Ember Diner on Callaway about 40 minutes ago. I want to know who he is." Marco asked no questions. That was what made him exceptional. Roman put his phone away and walked to his car. The information would arrive by evening. This was simply how the city worked when you'd built what he'd built. Names became legible, histories accessible, patterns visible. He would read what there was to read about Derek Hollis, and then he would decide whether the situation warranted further attention. He told himself this was operational caution. A man who'd walked into a neighborhood business with that specific quality of entitlement and walked out with that specific quality of suppressed resentment was an instability worth mapping. That was rational. That was simply how he managed his territory. He told himself this. He thought about her hands at her sides not shaking. He thought about 7 weeks of window checking, and what she'd been checking for, and how long she must have known he was close before he walked through the door. He drove back toward the waterfront, and he did not think about it further. He thought about it the entire drive. Marco's report arrived at 8:17 that evening, thorough and annotated with the editorial judgment of a man who'd learned to give his employer exactly the information needed and nothing that wasn't. Derek Hollis, 32. From Crestdale, 240 miles northeast. Son of Gerald Hollis, county commissioner. Nephew of Brian Hollis, Crestdale chief of police. Married 3 years to Mara Callahan. Divorced 7 months prior. One restraining order on file, obtained in Crestdale County. Applicant, Mara Callahan Hollis. Roman read the list of incidents that had supported the order's filing. He read it once through and then set it down for a moment. Then he picked it up and read it again. Subject Hollis, Marco had written, has been in the city for approximately 10 days. Current address, the Riverside Inn. Purpose of visit, unclear. However, subject made 3 prior visits to the city in the past 3 months, each of 2 to 3 days duration, before the current extended stay. Pattern suggests a period of reconnaissance preceding the current phase of contact. 3 prior trips in 3 months. Roman sat with this for a while. He'd built his operation on the understanding that the city was a system, and systems had pressure points and leverage and specific weaknesses that, once identified, could be managed. He understood power in its transactional form, in its territorial form, in the form that expressed itself through hierarchies of fear and compliance that he'd spent 2 decades learning to navigate and eventually to construct. He was not a sentimental man. He was not, in the way the word was commonly used, a good one. But he had a code. He'd always had it, even before it was useful to him, even before. It had a name, a specific architecture of what was and wasn't permissible, what constituted fair transaction and what constituted predation. He'd decided, at an age when such decisions felt permanent, which category of person he intended to be. Derek Hollis was using power the wrong way, using it with the confidence of a man who'd always been backed by institutional permission, a father in government, an uncle with a badge, and who had therefore never learned what happened when the power he wielded met something it couldn't move. Men like Derek had been taught by a lifetime of experience that there were no walls they couldn't walk through. The lesson tended to make them careless. Roman set down the report and looked out at the waterfront. Its lights multiplied and fractured on the dark surface of the water. He was not going to involve himself. That was not how this worked. A waitress he'd exchanged perhaps 40 words with over 11 visits, a personal dispute with no bearing on his operations, a situation that was not his business and whose involvement carried no strategic benefit. He was not going to involve himself. He picked the report back up and read the part about the 3 prior trips. He thought about a woman standing in a diner with her hands at her sides not shaking, saying ex-wife in a voice like a door being held shut from the inside by the last of her available strength. Then he picked up a different phone and called a man named Silas, who handled the quieter dimensions of information management, who knew how to establish presence without leaving evidence of it, how to make certain people aware that they were visible without those people understanding exactly how they'd become so. Find out where Hollis goes, Roman said. His patterns, his hours. Not intrusive. Just know where he is. Silas asked no questions. Roman put the phone down and poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey and drank it looking at the water. He thought about precautions and about the specific mathematics of a man with nothing to lose versus a man with institutional backing and 3 months of surveillance already completed. He thought about the particular species of patience that men like Derek deployed, the slow encirclement that looked like nothing happening until it suddenly became the only thing happening. He thought about the window checking. 7 weeks of it, every single morning, before she even knew he was in the city. The way her body had been tracking the threat before the threat made itself visible. And then he stopped thinking and started planning, which was the thing he was better at than almost anything. Mara did not sleep on Thursday night. She lay on her narrow bed in Mrs. Papadakis's house and listened to the building settle around her, the familiar catalog of sounds she'd memorized over 7 months, the third stair's particular creak, the radiator's rhythms, the slight vibration of the front hallway window when the wind came from the northeast. She knew every note of this building's nighttime vocabulary, and none of them tonight were Derek, and she still couldn't sleep. He'd been inside. That was the fact her mind kept returning to, unable to metabolize it into ordinary experience and file it away. For 7 months, she'd maintained the distance between Derek and everything she'd built here, the city, the neighborhood, the name, the room with the locking window. And now he'd walked through the door of the Ember and said her name in that particular tone, and the distance had collapsed like it had never existed. She went through her options the way she'd learned to go through options systematically, without the paralysis that came from letting emotion drive the assessment. She could call the detective in Crestdale who'd been reasonably sympathetic and ultimately powerless against a family that had built the county's institutional architecture from the inside. She could try to file a new order here, in the city, though the process would take time and the outcome was uncertain, and she'd already seen, once, exactly how much certainty a piece of paper provided. She could leave again, pack the duffel, find another city, another shelter, another board with another card on it. The thought of leaving made something in her chest compress to a point of pain, so sharp it surprised her with its clarity. 7 months. She had 7 months of something that was almost a life, almost a structure with walls and warmth, and people who expected her, who saved her the last blueberry muffin because they'd noticed she liked them, and she was not willing to dismantle it. She'd left once because she had no other option, and she would not leave again because Derek Hollis had decided to follow her. That was a line she was drawing in herself, in whatever bedrock remained of who she was beneath all the years of erosion. But what she would do instead that she couldn't entirely see. She thought, involuntarily, about the man at the corner stool. She'd clocked him early in her time at the Ember, the way she clocked anything that required navigation. June had told her enough, on his 4th visit, that Mara had filed him undermanaged carefully and then had proceeded to manage him the way she managed everything, with professionalism and distance and the precise economy of a woman who'd learned how to occupy the same room as powerful men without becoming interesting to them. He'd never given her cause to be afraid. That was the thing she kept returning to. He'd sat at his stool and ordered his coffee and tipped decently and looked at the door and never once made her feel like property or spectacle, never required her to perform ease or warmth or anything beyond basic professional courtesy, never taken anything she hadn't offered. In the specific calculus of threat that Mara had spent 3 years learning to run on every man in her vicinity, he consistently registered as safe. Not harmless, she wasn't naive enough to confuse the two, but specifically, precisely safe for her. This morning, he'd turned on his stool and looked at Derek, and Derek had left. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about it. And then she thought about the fact that she'd spent 7 months learning not to need anyone, building the specific internal architecture of self-sufficiency that was the only reliable protection she knew. She thought about how the instinct now rising in her to catalog a stranger's intervention as protection, to feel something warm and tentative toward anyone who represented safety, was the same instinct that had led her to Derek in the first place. He'd seemed safe once too. He'd been the wall between her and the world's noise, and she'd leaned into the shelter of it. And then one day the wall had turned, and the shelter had become the trap. She knew this. She'd spent 7 months making the knowledge into bone. She closed her eyes and listened to the building and thought about restraining orders and gray jackets and the particular quality of a smile that wanted her to know she'd been found. And sleep came late and shallow and full of sounds. She kept checking against the inventory. Friday morning arrived gray and cold, the first real teeth of autumn in the air. Mara reached the Ember at 6:50 and found June already there, standing just inside the door with her arms folded, which meant she'd arrived early and had been there long enough to develop an opinion about something. "Frank called me before 6, June said. "Camera picked up your man on the sidewalk outside last night. 2 in the morning. He stood out there for about 20 minutes. Mara absorbed this. 2 in the morning. She'd been lying awake listening to the building settle, and he'd been outside on the sidewalk 20 minutes away from where she was lying awake. The proximity of it, the way his surveillance and her sleeplessness had existed simultaneously in the same dark, without her knowing, did something cold to the back of her neck. "Frank wants to call the police. Report the violation. It's a Crestdale order," Mara said. She'd already run this calculation. The city police will say it's not their jurisdiction, or it'll take weeks to transfer, and he'll know we filed, and June was watching her carefully. "His family has reach up there. I don't know how far it extends. That's the problem." June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, carefully and without drama, the way she said things that required care and precision. "The man who comes in. Corner stool. He's been in this neighborhood for a long time. He looks out for things. People. when it's within his interests. This was a very specific way of saying something, and Mara understood exactly the specificity of it. She understood what June was not quite saying, the territory she was gesturing toward without entering. And she felt the vertigo that came with understanding that the world she was living in operated by different rules than the one she'd been raised to believe in. I don't want to owe anyone anything, she said. June nodded. I know. She paused. But sometimes the people who can actually do something aren't the people we were taught to ask. She looked at Mara with those dark, steady eyes. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm only telling you that he noticed. Yesterday he noticed. And now you know that he's the kind of person who notices things and then does something about what he's noticed. Mara tied her apron. She went to start her section. She didn't know what she was going to do. She didn't know if there was anything to do, or what doing it would cost, or whether the specific safety she'd glimpsed in that corner stool was real, or whether it was just the newest version of the oldest mistake she'd ever made, mistaking a man's power for protection before she understood what the protection would require of her. The corner stool was empty. The morning was just beginning. Outside, the October wind moved through Callaway Street, and somewhere in this city Derek Hollis had stood on a sidewalk at 2 in the morning watching the place where she worked, with the patience of a man who believed absolutely in the inevitability of his own eventual success. Mara thought about inevitability. She thought about how certain men deployed it as a kind of gravity, a force you couldn't argue with, a story they told so convincingly that the people in it forgot they had the option to stop listening. She was listening. She was also thinking. The door opened at 7:16. Roman Voss walked in. He took his stool. He folded his coat. He looked at the door and then at the window, and then, as June set his coffee down without a word, at Mara, who had stopped 3 feet from the counter with a carafe in one hand and was looking directly back at him. He said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing, at letting silence exist without filling it, at being present in a room without requiring the room to acknowledge him. But the look he gave her was direct and quiet, and entirely without the quality that required management. No hook in it. No performance. Just a look that said, I know what happened yesterday, and I am here this morning. Mara held it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, with a steadiness that surprised her slightly, Can I get you more toast? Roman glanced at his plate. The toast had already arrived, deposited by June's automatic hand while Mara was standing there not looking at it. Something crossed his face, barely there, barely a thing at all, but she saw it. Looks like you already did, he said. Mara looked at the plate, and something loosened, very slightly, in her chest, so small that she couldn't have named it if pressed, but real. She refilled his coffee and moved to the next table, and she did not check the window when she passed it. Not that once. It was a small thing. In the arithmetic of fear, where every piece of attention that went to Derek was a piece taken from something she'd built and wanted to keep, moving past the window without looking was a reclamation. A tiny one, but real. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know who the man at the corner stool was in any dimension she'd been taught mattered, didn't know his history or his code or what his particular form of safety would eventually cost. She didn't know what Derek would do next, or how soon, or how much worse it would get before it became something else. She didn't know whether the wall she'd been quietly building in herself was strong enough to hold, or whether this morning's moment of not checking was courage or delusion. But she was still here. She was still standing. And at the corner stool, a man with cold eyes and a very particular quality of stillness drank his coffee and watched the door. Outside, the city moved through its October morning indifferent, ordinary, and full of its own machinery, and inside the Ember Diner, something that neither of them would have been able to name, yet had begun to take shape in the space between a woman who'd survived worse and a man who was just beginning to understand that he intended to make sure she didn't have to. Silas's second report arrived on Saturday morning while Roman was at the waterfront office reviewing quarterly numbers that required his signature and nothing else, the operational kind of work that Marco handled with greater competence than Roman would have admitted to anyone except himself, and possibly Marco, on a good day with decent coffee. The numbers were fine. The numbers were always fine. Roman had built the kind of system that didn't require his constant intervention to remain functional, which was the point, which was the whole architecture of what he'd spent 20 years constructing, something that ran on its own internal logic rather than on his daily presence. You built a thing to outlast your attention, or you built a thing that would collapse the moment you looked away, and he'd made his choice about which kind of builder he intended to be at an age when most choices felt reversible and hadn't recognized them as permanent. He set the numbers aside when Silas's message came through. Subject maintains a vehicle registered to a rental company downtown. Has been observed in the following locations in the past 48 hours. The block of Callaway Street containing the Ember Diner, 6 separate instances ranging from 30 minutes to 2 hours in duration, at various times between 6 a.m. and midnight. The boarding house on Westing Avenue, East Side twice, once in the evening and once early morning, 2 a.m. Friday, consistent with the earlier observation. A bar called Quincy's on the south end of the neighborhood twice, staying approximately 90 minutes on each occasion. And once, a parking structure on Belmont Street, from which the boarding house entrance is visible at a distance, for approximately 4 hours on Friday afternoon. For hours, Roman read the part about the parking structure again. Then he set the phone down and looked at the water. The parking structure meant planning. It meant patience of a specific kind, not the natural patience of someone who could wait, but the constructed patience of someone who was working towards something, who had decided on an outcome and was now methodically acquiring the information needed to achieve it. For hours in a parking structure with a sight line to a boarding house meant he knew where she lived. It meant he was learning her schedule in and out of work. It meant that whatever had begun on Thursday morning when he'd walked into the Ember with that smile was not a spontaneous act. It was a stage in something longer. Roman understood stages. He understood how men who operated through the systematic erosion of other people's safety thought and planned. He understood the particular calculus of a man who'd never in his life experienced a consequence he couldn't negotiate away, who had therefore never developed the cognitive architecture that processed consequence as real. To such a man, the restraining order was a formality. The city was a jurisdiction beyond his family's institutional reach, which wasn't a deterrent so much as a logistical challenge. The woman he was tracking was property he'd temporarily mislaid, and the resolution of that situation was simply a matter of time and correct positioning. Roman picked up the phone and called Silas back. "I want someone on the parking structure. 24 hours. Rotating. If he goes up there again, I want to know within 5 minutes." Silas didn't ask why a parking structure on the east side of the neighborhood required 24-hour surveillance. That was the value of Silas. Roman considered calling Marco next and decided against it. Marco would want a strategic framework, a reason, a way to situate this in the operational logic of the territory. Roman didn't have a strategic framework. He had a woman who worked the morning shift at a diner on Callaway Street, and a man who was spending his Saturday afternoons in a parking structure learning her movements, and something in Roman Voss that had decided, with the particular finality of a decision that had already been made before the conscious mind caught up, that this was not going to continue. He went back to the numbers. They were still fine. He came to the Ember on Sunday, off his usual schedule. This wasn't entirely unusual. He occasionally came on weekends when business brought him to this end of the neighborhood, but he was aware, as he walked through the door at 9:15, that the business this morning was less the operational kind and more the kind he was still working out how to categorize. Mara was there. Sunday's shift, which he'd known. She was at the counter when he came in, and she turned at the sound of the door with the reflexive vigilance she brought to every entrance these days, and when she registered who it was, something in her posture adjusted, not relaxed exactly. The tension didn't leave, but it redistributed, the way weight shifts when you move from one kind of burden to one you know better how to carry. She brought his coffee without being asked. He'd noticed she'd started doing that as of Thursday, not waiting for him to settle before coming over, but bringing it immediately, the way June did, as if he'd graduated into a category of regular that didn't require the standard processing time. He didn't know if she'd decided that consciously or whether it had simply happened, the automatic adjustment of a person calibrating her environment in real time. "You changed your day?" she said. He had. He hadn't explained why, hadn't needed to, but she'd noticed. "Business nearby," he said. She nodded. She was studying the surface of his coffee with the attention of someone who was actually thinking about something else. She had the particular quality of stillness that came to her sometimes between tables, not vacant, more like compressed, a person conserving. He'd noticed it before, but it seemed more pronounced today. "He's been back," she said, without preamble or specific reference, as if continuing a conversation they'd already been having. He could have been talking about the Saturday customers or a supplier or any number of things, but she wasn't. They both knew she wasn't. Not inside, she added quickly. Outside. I can feel it when I pass the window, even when I don't look. Like the air changes. Roman said nothing. He was listening to the specific information in what she'd just told him, not the content of it, which Silas's reports had already provided, but the quality. The fact that she'd said it to him. That she'd brought this particular thing to this particular person on a Sunday morning without preamble or apparent decision, as if the words had been waiting and his arrival had simply opened the door. He looked at her and thought about 7 months of self-sufficiency, about a woman who'd rebuilt herself from nothing in a new city and who didn't ask for help because she'd learned that help had a cost, and she'd already paid more than she could afford. I know, he said. She looked at him. Just looked, without speaking, and something crossed her face that he couldn't fully read, part question, part something else, something that was working through information quickly and hadn't finished yet. How, she said. It wasn't quite a question. He kept her eyes. Because I pay attention, he said, and let her decide what that meant. She stood with this for a moment. He watched her run some internal calculation that involved things he couldn't entirely access: history, experience, the specific way her assessment of people had been shaped by years of learning, which quality of attention was safe, and which kind preceded harm. She didn't ask him why. She didn't ask what he intended to do. She put both of those questions somewhere and set them aside with the precision of a woman who'd learned to take what information was available and save the harder questions for when she had more to go on. Has he done anything? She said instead, since Thursday. Not inside, he said, and left the echo of her own phrase in the air between them, and watched her understand from it that the not inside was precise, that she was correct, that the outside, the sidewalk, the parking structure, the slow encircling was ongoing and documented. She absorbed this with the stillness of a person who'd expected bad news and had been right, which was its own particular loneliness. Mara, he said. She looked at him. He said nothing for a moment. This was not evasion. He was finding the specific, accurate thing, the one that would land precisely and not differently from how he meant it. You don't have to handle this alone, she said, quietly and immediately. I'm used to handling things alone. I know that too. The diner was filling around them. A family with 2 children came through the door and Mara's professional attention pivoted automatically. She was at the table, distributing children's menus, asking about juice or milk, performing the entire choreography of her role with the seamlessness of someone who could divide her attention without diminishing either part of it. But when she came back to pass behind the counter, she moved closer to his stool than the path required, and she said, without stopping, without looking at him, I don't know what to do with you. He picked up his coffee. You don't have to do anything with me, he said. He said it to the window and not to her, which was a way of giving her the statement without requiring her to respond to it. Just let me be aware of what's happening. She was already 3 tables away. She didn't answer, but she didn't check the window when she passed it, and he noted that, filed it somewhere, and stayed through the breakfast rush. If you're as deep into this story as I am right now, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. I upload new stories every week, and you don't want to miss what's coming. Your support is the reason I keep going. Now, back to them. The thing that happened on Tuesday changed the arithmetic entirely. Roman learned about it through Silas, who called at 11:43 in the morning, which was not Silas's pattern. Silas communicated through messages by default, reserving calls for urgency, and his voice, when it came through the line, had the particular flatness of a man delivering information he knew would require action. Subject approached the boarding house on Westing this morning at 9:20, Silas said. Spoke to the landlady. Identified himself as the subject's brother. Said he was concerned about her welfare and wanted to verify she was receiving her mail properly. He obtained her room number. Roman was very still. The landlady gave it to him. Yes. She had no reason not to. Roman thought about the specificity of that particular maneuver, the brother story, the mail framing, the plausible concern wrapped around an information extraction that would give Derek the one piece of geography he'd been missing. He'd had the building. Now he had the floor, the door, the number. Was there anything else? One thing. After leaving the building, subject went back to Quincy's. Stayed an hour. Made 2 calls on his personal phone. One to a Crestdale number registered to a Gerald Hollis. His father. Yes. Roman thanked Silas and ended the call. He sat for a moment in his office with the door closed, the waterfront light coming in gray through the window, and he thought about Gerald Hollis and Brian Hollis and the particular species of immunity that was conferred by family connections running deep enough to have confused a man into believing it was permanent, structural, geographically universal rather than locally specific. He thought about what a man called his father after obtaining a woman's room number, and he thought about what the father might say in return and whether any of it would show up in time to matter. He called Marco. "There's a situation," he said. He sighed. "Personal, but it's in the neighborhood, and it's going to become a problem." Marco had worked for him long enough to understand the specific meaning of personal, but, he said, "What do you need?" "Someone at the boarding house on Westing. Visible, but not intrusive. He's gotten the room number. He's going to try to use it. And the woman is not to know she's being watched. I don't want her to feel surveilled. I want her to feel safe." Marco was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was noting the distinction. Then he said, "I'll put Petra there. She looks like she's waiting for a bus." Petra had been waiting for a bus in various neighborhoods for 4 years without anyone ever questioning why the same woman was always standing slightly to the left of everything. It was an exceptional skill. "And the man," Marco said, "leave him where he is for now. I want him visible. I want to know every move. And after that," Roman looked at the water, "after that, I'll know what to say to him." Marco said nothing further. He understood that when Roman used the phrase "know what to say," he was not talking about words. Roman spent the rest of the morning on the operational work that never fully stopped requiring him calls, decisions, the quiet management of the system he'd built. He did all of it with the focused competence that had made him what he was, and underneath it, at a level he kept deliberately separated from the working surface of his attention, he thought about a woman in a boarding house on Westing Avenue who didn't know that the room number she'd kept private for 7 months was no longer private, who was at work right now with a carafe in each hand and her back straight and her hands not shaking, building toward a safety she believed was still intact. He thought about whether to tell her. He thought about what telling her would cost against what not telling her would cost, and he ran the arithmetic the way he ran every other form of arithmetic precisely, without sentimentality, without letting what he wanted the answer to be influence what the answer actually was. She needed to know. Not everything, not the surveillance, or the parking structure, or the calls to Gerald Hollis. Not the full scope of a monitoring operation she hadn't consented to and couldn't be asked to absorb right now. But the room number. The specific breach of the boundary she believed was holding. He would tell her. He would tell her carefully. He would give her the information she needed to take action without giving her the information that would make her feel like she'd traded one form of surveillance for another. He went to the Ember at 6 in the evening, when the dinner rush was beginning to thin and Mara's shift, he'd worked out, ended at 7. June was still behind the counter, wiping it down in the economical way that meant she was halfway through the cleanup that preceded close. She looked up when he came in, and her expression did the specific thing it did when she was deciding how to locate something in the available categories. Then she stepped to the end of the counter and said, quietly, "She's in the back finishing up her section." He sat down. 5 minutes later, Mara came through the service door with her apron in her hand and her jacket over her arm, and she saw him and stopped. Not startled, just registering, processing. Adding a data point to the tally, she was clearly keeping about what his presence meant and when to file it under something she hadn't named yet. She came to the counter. She didn't sit, stood, with the jacket folded over her arm, ready to be somewhere else. "This is unusual," she said. "I have something to tell you." He kept his voice even. "Not alarming. Just a fact. He went to your boarding house this morning. Spoke to Mrs. Papadakis. He got your room number." The color didn't leave her face, exactly, but the warmth did. He watched the information land and settle, and watched her process it with the quiet, systematic efficiency of a woman who'd been processing bad news alone for a long time. She didn't make a sound. She stood very still with her jacket over her arm, and she thought. "How do you know that?" she said. Her voice was level. "I have people who pay attention to things in this neighborhood." She looked at him. The look was direct and complicated and contained the question she wasn't asking yet. He waited. Then she said, "How long?" "Since Friday." She absorbed this too. He could see the specific dimensions of what it meant to her gratitude and unease occupying the same space, neither one quite able to displace the other. Someone had been watching over her without her knowledge, which was a form of care and also a form of the thing she'd spent 7 months escaping. He said, before she could construct the full weight of the unease, "You don't owe me anything for it. I want to be clear about that. I'm not keeping a ledger." She looked at him for a long time. "What are you doing?" she said, and she meant it plainly, without edge, a genuine question, asked by a woman who'd survived long enough to know that plain questions were the only ones worth asking. He thought about how to answer honestly. He thought about the code he'd built for himself and what it said about this specific situation, and about the specific texture of wrong he'd identified in Derek Hollis from the first moment, the way it had read to him in his body before his mind had cataloged it. "Something about your situation is wrong," he said. "I notice wrong things. I do something about them. That's what I'm doing. Something about your situation." She repeated it quietly, testing the specific shape of it. "Not something about you." No, not about her. He'd been careful with that word because it mattered, because the difference between noticing a wrong situation and deciding a specific woman was interesting was the entire difference between what he was doing and what Derek was doing, and he was not going to blur that line. She looked at the counter for a moment. Then she said, "I have to change the lock on my door." "Yes, and I should probably tell Mrs. Papadakis not to give out room information to anyone." "I'd suggest that, yes." And then? He met her eyes. "And then you keep living your life. You go to work and come home and do what you were doing before he showed up. You don't need to change your routes or your schedule or anything else. Just know that if something changes, if he escalates, you tell me." "Just tell you," she said. "Just tell me." She was still running that calculation, the one with all the variables he couldn't see. He let her run it. Didn't push, didn't fill the silence with reassurance that she hadn't asked for. He just sat there and let her look at him and look at the problem and look at whatever she was weighing in the balance. "Why?" she finally said. "Not a challenge. Genuine. Because the people who are supposed to help you haven't," he said. "And I can." She held his eyes for a moment longer. Then she put on her jacket, straightening the collar with the small, deliberate gesture of a woman organizing herself for the outside world, and she said, "Thank you." Not effusively. Not with the performance of gratitude that required the other person to demonstrate they'd received it properly. Just 2 clean words, plainly meant, directly delivered. He nodded once. She left. He stayed for another coffee he didn't need and thought about very little, which for him was either a very good sign or a very bad one. Mrs. Papadakis received Mara's request that evening with the attentive gravity of a woman who'd been managing a boarding house for 19 years and had developed, over those decades, a comprehensive taxonomy of the kinds of trouble that appeared at her door. She changed the lock that same night, using a replacement she kept in the utility closet for exactly this kind of occasion, and she looked at Mara with the particular mix of concern and pragmatism that characterized her approach to difficult situations in her house. "There is a man," she said. It was not entirely a question. "There is," Mara said. Mrs. Papadakis had seen this particular configuration before. She handed Mara the new key and said, "You tell me if you see him near the building." "I have a nephew." Mara said she would tell her. She didn't ask about the nephew. That night, she slept better than she had since Tuesday. Not well, not the deep. Even sleep she'd been working toward over 7 months of slowly learning what safety felt like in her body, but better. The specific knowledge that someone other than herself was tracking the dimensions of the threat changed something in the internal arithmetic. Not because she trusted it entirely, not because she'd suspended the caution she'd built with such effort, but because the weight had been slightly redistributed, shared, and shared weight was less likely to break the person carrying it. She thought about Roman Voss while she was falling asleep. She thought about him carefully, the way she thought about anything she wasn't sure how to file yet. He was a dangerous man. She wasn't confused about that. She'd grown up in Crestdale, which was not naive about the way certain men built certain kinds of power, and she'd spent 3 years married to a man whose family's power operated through institutional channels, while his own operated through the more personal channel of a closed door and a lowered voice. She knew what power looked like when it was worn by someone who'd made peace with what it required. She knew what it looked like when it was worn by someone who hadn't. Roman Voss, from everything she could observe, had made peace with it. That was either reassuring or the most dangerous thing about him, and she didn't yet know which, and she was not in a position right now to fully resolve that question. What she knew was that he'd turned on a stool and looked at Derek, and Derek had left. That he'd been watching out for her without telling her, and had chosen to tell her when the information became something she needed to have. That he'd told her, plainly and without packaging, that she owed him nothing. These were the data points she had. She worked with data points. She'd learned to trust data over narrative over the story. People told about themselves, over the performance of safety that could be maintained indefinitely as long as the conditions that revealed a person's true nature never materialized. Data was what happened. Data was the thing you could rely on when everything else was interpretation. The data she had on Roman Voss said, watches carefully, intervenes precisely, does not take what isn't offered, does not require performance, does not smile the way Derek smiled. She built that into her assessment and let herself sleep. Wednesday arrived with the specific coldness of October resolved into something that intended to stay. Mara wore an extra layer under her uniform and took the slightly longer route to work that put her on the opposite side of Callaway from the Ember's plate glass window, for as long as possible, not because she was afraid to be seen, but because she'd decided, with the small sovereignty she was reclaiming one decision at a time, that she wouldn't give him the window anymore. He could stand there if he wanted. She wasn't going to walk past the front of it. June was behind the counter with her second coffee and a look that conveyed, without words, that she'd received whatever information the neighborhood's general atmosphere chose to distribute and had updated her assessment accordingly. He talked to you, June said. Roman. He did. June nodded. In the way that meant the nod was everything. Confirmation, assessment, filing. She picked up her coffee. He's a careful man, she said. Takes a while to decide something. Once he's decided, he doesn't undecide. Mara tied her apron. What's he decided? June looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. That's something you'd have to ask him. The morning passed without incident. The window checking had changed in character. She still looked, still performed the small audit of the street. But the quality of it was different, less the terrified counting of a woman alone against a threat, and more the practice scan of someone whose team had expanded. A small thing. But the smallness of it was its own form of significant. Roman came at his usual time. He sat at his usual stool. June brought his coffee with the efficiency of long habit, and Mara, who was on the far side of the room with a family of 4, noticed him arrive the way she'd started noticing him arrive, with the particular peripheral awareness that wasn't fear and wasn't something she'd fully named yet, just a registration of presence that felt different from the registration of every other presence in the room. She came to refill his coffee 20 minutes in. Not because he needed it, the cup was still half full, but because the moment had a practical shape she could move within, a reason to be standing close that didn't require her to explain herself. Nothing unusual this morning, she said quietly. No, he agreed. She felt him looking at her in the specific way he sometimes looked at her, the look that had no hook in it, that wasn't taking anything, that was simply direct the way some things are direct, honesty or light. She'd been thinking about that look and what to do with it. Can I ask you something? She said. He indicated that she could. Have you done this before? This specific thing. She gestured slightly, meaning the watching, the attention, the particular quality of involvement he'd extended without being asked. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, just precise. In a general sense, he said, when something in my territory needs managing. In this specific sense, he paused. Not before. She absorbed that. Not before, meaning she was a specific case, not a category, meaning the particular calculation he'd run had produced a result he hadn't run before. She didn't know how she felt about that. She felt several things about that simultaneously and couldn't yet determine which was most accurate. I spent 3 years learning not to need anyone, she said. She said it without particular inflection, just data. And 7 months reminding myself that was correct. And now, he said, and now I have a man who knows my room number and a restraining order that's worth about as much as the paper it's printed on in terms of actual protection. She looked at the surface of his coffee. I'm being practical. The word practical landed in the space between them, and they both looked at it for a moment. It was the word she'd chosen to put between herself and something she wasn't saying, and they both knew it, and he didn't push at it. You're allowed to be practical, he said. I know that. She looked at him directly, because she'd decided something, though she couldn't have pinned down the precise moment of decision. I also know that practical and stupid can look identical from the outside, depending on how things turn out. So I want you to know that I know the difference between someone who is watching out for me and someone who is watching me. I know what both of those things look like. He met her eyes steadily. Good, he said. She went back to her tables. He stayed until 10:15, which was longer than usual, and when he left she was aware of the departure in the room's atmosphere the way you're aware of weather changing, not through a single identifiable sense, but through some aggregate of small signals that registered as a unit. The diner felt more ordinary when he was gone. She wasn't certain whether that was reassuring. Silas called Roman on Thursday evening at 7:49. Subject had a visitor at Quincy's today. Silas's voice had the same flatness as before, the information delivery register that Roman had calibrated over 4 years of working with him. Male, late 40s. Drove down from Crestdale. Stayed approximately 3 hours. Subject and visitor appeared to be developing a plan of some kind, tone and body language consistent with strategy rather than catch up. What did you get? Not enough for specifics. Enough to know the visitor had authority over the subject in some way. Subject was deferring. The visitor's vehicle is registered to a property company in Crestdale. Cross-referencing the address against county records. Roman said, fast as you can on the address. The address came back 40 minutes later. The property company was a holding entity registered to Brian Hollis, the uncle, the chief of police. Roman sat with this for a full 5 minutes, which was an unusual length of time for him to spend simply sitting. The uncle had driven 240 miles to a bar in the city to meet with Derek Hollis for 3 hours. The operational conclusion was not complicated. Whatever Derek had been doing independently, the surveillance, the parking structure, the room number had now acquired family backing. The family had looked at the situation and decided their preferred outcome required direct involvement. The uncle, specifically, which meant this was being managed at the level of people who understood how systems worked and how to move within them without visible exposure. This changed the calculus. Roman had been operating on the assumption that Derek Hollis was an individual problem, a man with structural advantages and a grievance he was acting on alone, dangerous because of those advantages and that grievance, but bounded by the nature of individual action. An individual could be redirected. An individual could be made to understand, through the specific language Roman's territory spoke, that the cost-benefit analysis of a particular course of action had changed in ways that made continuation inadvisable. A family, specifically a family with institutional reach in the law enforcement infrastructure of another jurisdiction, was a different order of problem. He called Marco. Tell me about Brian Hollis. Marco was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was shifting contexts. Then, Crestdale Chief of Police. 12 years in the position. Connected at the state level, a few favors in the right places. Not a clean record, but nothing documented. Has a history of making problems go away for the right people. Has he ever come into this city before? Not on my radar. But he's here now. He is. Roman looked at the water. There's a situation developing that I need to get ahead of. Marco waited. The woman from the Ember. Her ex-husband has family backing now. The uncle drove down today. A pause. How serious? Serious enough that a chief of police thought it warranted a personal trip. Marco was quiet again, longer this time. When he spoke, his voice was careful with the particular care that Roman recognized as genuine concern being managed into professional register. Roman, if this becomes a conflict with law enforcement, even out-of-jurisdiction law enforcement, I understand the implications. I know you do. I just want to name them. Named. Roman said. Here's what I want. I want to know everything about Brian Hollis's history, his reach, his vulnerabilities. And I want to know what the visit today produced. Not speculation. What actually came out of 3 hours in that bar. I'll need a couple of days. You have one. Marco said nothing more. He knew what one day meant in Roman's operational vocabulary. Roman sat at his desk for a long time after the call ended, looking at the waterfront and thinking about the specific texture of what was in front of him. He'd set something in motion 2 weeks ago when he'd turned on a stool and looked at Derek Hollis, and he'd been honest with himself in the moments since about what that meant, that he'd made a choice, that the choice had implications, that the implications would develop whether or not he continued to make active decisions about them. You could not announce yourself to a man like Derek and then withdraw. The territory had its own logic. He was not going to withdraw. He thought about her voice. I spent 3 years learning not to need anyone. He thought about the specificity of that statement, not I prefer to be independent, not I value my autonomy, but the precise, time-stamped record of a decision made under specific conditions and maintained through specific effort. You learn not to need anyone when needing someone had cost you everything. The learning was a scar dressed up as a principle. He understood that. He'd done the same work in different terrain. He pulled up the file Silas had compiled and read through it again, the incident reports, the restraining order, the specific documented record of 3 years translated into the dry language of official documents that always managed to make suffering sound like paperwork. He read it with the clinical attention he brought to operational planning, and he felt, underneath that attention, something that didn't fit the clinical register, something that operated in a frequency he didn't usually make room for. Something that had a name, but that he was not yet willing to say out loud, even to himself. He closed the file. He made his calls, gave his instructions, set his people in motion. The system ran on its own logic, he just had to aim it correctly. And then he did something he almost never did in the middle of the workday. He went to the Ember. It was 4 in the afternoon, between shifts, and the diner was quiet. One couple at a window table, a man at the counter with a newspaper. June was there, running the abbreviated afternoon arrangement, and she looked up when he came in with an expression that moved quickly through recognition and something else, something more alert. "She here?" he said. "Evening shift starts at 5, June said. Then, carefully, "Is something wrong?" "Maybe." He sat at his stool. "Can you make sure she's not alone tonight after close? That she has someone to walk with? Or a car home?" June studied him. He said, "There may be people involved that we didn't expect." June had been in this neighborhood for 11 years. She understood the word people when it was deployed in that register. She said, "I'll drive her." He thanked her. He drank the coffee she brought without asking for it. And he looked at the window, and he thought about the specific shape of what he was going to do, and whether there was a version of it that didn't require the particular thing he was preparing to deploy. There wasn't. He'd already run that arithmetic. Some problems solved themselves with the right quality of attention. Some required words. Some required the specific, final clarity that came when a man understood, beyond the reach of his institutional backing or his family connections or his long-cultivated belief in his own immunity, that he was visible, entirely, to someone for whom visibility was the prelude to consequence, and that the consequence in question had no interest in negotiating. Derek Hollis was going to have that conversation. Roman just needed to know what the uncle had said first. Mara came in at 5. She came through the back, the way the staff always did, and June was there in the kitchen doorway with the specific look Mara had come to associate with something happening, not emergency. June never wore emergency on her face, but alertness, updated information, the quiet recalibration of someone who'd received new data and was deciding how to distribute it. "He came by this afternoon," June said. Mara's pulse did the small thing it did now when Roman was referenced unexpectedly, not fear, not the old automatic spike of threat assessment, but something in a different register that she was still learning how to categorize. She tied her apron. "What did he say?" "That you shouldn't walk home alone tonight. That he wants me to drive you." She absorbed this. She thought about what had changed between yesterday morning, when things had felt measured and provisional and holding, and now, when something had apparently shifted enough that he'd come to the diner in the middle of the afternoon to change the arrangement. Did he say why? June's look was careful. He said maybe, which means yes, but he doesn't know everything yet. Mara thought about the uncle in the bar. She didn't know about the uncle yet. What she knew was that Roman Voss had come to her workplace in the middle of his afternoon to make sure she had an escort home, and that this was information. Data. The kind that required updating her assessment. She said, "Okay." June's expression did the small thing it did when she approved of something without making it a production. She handed Mara a coffee and went back to her section. The evening shift was steady without being overwhelming, the usual Wednesday pattern, regulars and walk-ins, and the particular comfort of known rhythms. Mara moved through it with the fluency she'd built over 7 months, and underneath the fluency she thought about what it meant that things had escalated to the point of afternoon visits and arranged escorts, and whether escalation from that man's direction meant something was about to break or something was about to be resolved. She thought about the specific difference between the two. She thought about what resolution meant in the world Roman Voss operated in, and whether she had a position on that, and what the honest answer was when she searched herself for it. The honest answer surprised her slightly. She was not afraid of what he would do. She was not afraid of the methods it would involve. She had spent 3 years living with the particular violence of a man who deployed it casually and called it normal, and she had spent 7 months learning to trust her own assessment of threat and safety again, and her assessment of Roman Voss was that he was not going to hurt her, was not going to require anything of her she hadn't chosen, was not going to turn out to be the same category of danger dressed in different clothes. What she hadn't expected was to care what he thought of her. That was the specific surprise, not the gratitude, which she could locate and name and keep at a professional distance, but the other thing. The thing that had started, she could trace it backward with some precision, around the 6th or 7th visit, when she'd started bringing his coffee before he asked and had noticed that the automatic decision to do so hadn't felt like service, had felt like something else, something she'd filed under "Don't examine this right now" and left there. She examined it briefly, standing at the service window waiting for an order to come up. She thought about the way he listened completely, with the specific quality of attention of someone for whom listening was not the prelude to speaking, but an act in itself. She thought about the specific absence of performance in everything he did around her. No charm, no reassurance, no angling for something. Just presence, clean and direct, offered without invoice. She thought about his voice saying, "You don't have to handle this alone," and the fact that it was the first time in 3 years someone had said anything like that to her, without following it immediately with something it cost her. She thought about the fact that she'd had this thought, and she filed it back where it had come from. The order came up. She went to her table. June drove her home at 9:30, the two of them quiet in the car, in the way of people who have said the necessary things and are comfortable with what remains. When Mara got out in front of Mrs. Papadakis's building, June sat until she was inside and the door had closed, and then drove away. Mara climbed to her floor with her keys already in her hand and went into her room, which still had the smell of fresh wood and metal from the new lock. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window and thought about the city's ordinary darkness outside it. She thought about Roman Voss telling Marco, whoever Marco was, that she was under his protection. She didn't know he'd said this. She had no evidence he'd said this. But she knew it the way she knew things that hadn't been confirmed yet, through the accumulated logic of everything observable, through the pattern of his decisions, through the specific quality of the attention he'd deployed from the moment he'd turned on his stool and looked at Derek. She knew it. She thought about what that meant and whether she wanted it, and what the honest answer was. She wanted it. That was the honest answer, and it terrified her enough that she put it away immediately and lay down and looked at the ceiling and thought about practical things until sleep came. Marco's full report arrived Friday morning at 6. Roman read it at his desk with his first coffee of the day and the specific quality of concentrated attention that operational information required. Marco had assembled it with his usual precision, not just the facts but the architecture that supported them, the relationships that gave each piece its meaning. Brian Hollis had two primary concerns. The first was Derek's exposure, specifically the restraining order, which if enforced and prosecuted would create a documented record that could complicate Derek's life in ways that reflected on the family. The second was Roman specifically, though Derek hadn't known Roman's identity when he described the encounter at the Ember. Brian had apparently known immediately. Brian had apparently sat very still when Derek described the man at the corner stool and had then been very quiet for several minutes. The conclusion the uncle had reached Marco had assembled this from inference, and one direct intelligence source whose name Roman did not ask for was to withdraw, to advise Derek to cut his losses and return to Crestdale. Brian Hollis was not a coward, but he was a practical man, which was the specific quality that had allowed him to build and maintain his family's institutional reach over 25 years, and a practical man in Brian Hollis's position understood that jurisdiction was not a sufficient shield against all categories of consequence. Roman had expected to read that conclusion with relief. He read it with something more careful, because there was a second part. Derek had not accepted the uncle's advice cleanly. The meeting had ended without resolution. Derek had argued Marco's source indicated the conversation had grown heated, that he'd come too far, invested too much time, to leave without what he'd come for. The uncle had warned him. Derek had implied that the decision was his to make. Men who argued with the advice to withdraw, in Roman's experience, didn't withdraw. What they did was accelerate. He called Silas before he'd finished his coffee. "Move to a closer position on the boarding house," he said. "If he goes near it before I've spoken to him, I want to know before he reaches the door." Then he called Marco. "I need to know where Hollis will be this morning, and I need Petra moved from the boarding house to the Ember." Marco said, "You're going to talk to him today, before he makes another decision?" Marco was quiet for a moment. Do you want backup? No. Roman looked at the water. This needs to be a conversation, not a demonstration. Marco said nothing, which meant he had a view that differed from Roman's, but understood it was not his view to impose. Roman finished his coffee and went to find Derek Hollis. He found him where Silas said he'd be, in the parking structure on Belmont Street, on the 3rd level, in the car with its sight line to the boarding house entrance. Roman walked up the concrete ramp at 8:45 with his hands in his coat pockets, and the particular quality of purposefulness that communicated, to anyone paying the right kind of attention, that the person approaching knew exactly where they were going and had already decided what would happen when they got there. Derek saw him while he was still 20 yards out. Roman watched the recognition happen the moment when the face in the car's side mirror made the connection, found the right category, and produced the specific expression that Roman associated with men who believed they had options that they were rapidly discovering they didn't. He didn't run. Roman hadn't expected him to run. Men like Derek ran toward things, not away from them. It was their primary orientation to the world, the accumulated lesson of a lifetime of systems that had accommodated them. Roman reached the car and stood by the driver's window and didn't knock on the glass or gesture for it to open. He simply stood, hands in pockets, and waited, and the waiting did its work in 12 seconds before Derek rolled the window down. "You're on my territory," Roman said. His voice was conversational. Not loud, not threatening, just factual. The specific fact delivery that left no interpretive space. "You've been on my territory for 2 weeks. I've let it go on because I was gathering information. I have enough information now." Derek's jaw was tight. The easy assurance he'd worn into the Ember was in deficit. He was working to maintain it, but it was costing him in ways that showed. "Who are you?" "Someone who pays attention to this neighborhood," Roman said, "and to the people in it." "She's my wife." "Was your wife?" Roman's voice did not change in quality or temperature. "There's a legal document that says otherwise. There are also 7 months and 240 miles that say otherwise. You drove 240 miles, and you've been here 2 weeks, and you've been in that parking structure 4 times in those 2 weeks looking at a building where she lives." He paused. "I know what you're doing. I want you to understand that I know, completely, every specific piece of what you've been doing. The parking structure, the room number, the bar, and the meeting with your uncle on Tuesday." Derek went very still. "Your uncle is a practical man," Roman said. "He gave you practical advice. I'm going to assume you're capable of the same quality of reasoning, and I'm going to give you the same advice. Once, clearly. Leave. Go back to Crestdale. Do not come back to this city. Do not contact Mara Callahan by any means, at any location, ever again." "That restraining order," Derek started. "Doesn't matter," Roman said. "I'm not talking about what's legal. I'm talking about what's possible." Roman tilted his head slightly, just enough to shift the quality of what was landing. "This city is mine in all the ways that actually determine what happens in it. You can choose to believe that or not. The outcome will be the same either way." The silence in the parking structure had a particular quality: the cold, echoing stillness of concrete and fluorescent light, and the sound of traffic filtering up from the street below, the ordinary sounds of a city going about its morning. Derek's hands were on the wheel. Roman said, "I know you believe this ends the way you want it to. I know your whole life has been structured around the experience of things ending the way you want. I'm telling you that this is the specific situation in which that experience does not apply. She is not going back to you. She is not accessible to you. She is under my protection. Those are the terms of what exists now. You can work with those terms, or you can work against them. But you should be very clear about what working against them costs." He let the silence sit for 3 full seconds. Then he said, "Your uncle understands. I suggest you call him." He turned and walked back down the concrete ramp, hands still in his coat pockets, without looking back. Behind him, Derek Hollis sat in the rental car with his hands on the wheel and his face doing something complicated, and Roman could feel it in the air the way you feel the specific quality of a decision being made, the moment when a thing is either broken or isn't, when the pressure has finally found either the fracture or the foundation. He walked out into the October morning. His phone was already in his hand. He called Silas. Don't lose him. She found out about the parking structure on Friday afternoon. Not from Roman. From June, who had been told by June's particular network of neighborhood information the specific web of relationships and observations that 11 years had built into something that rivaled official intelligence for density and accuracy. That the man from the Ember had gone to the parking structure on Belmont and had a conversation with Derek Hollis that had lasted approximately 7 minutes. June told Mara at the end of the afternoon shift, sitting in the kitchen with 2 cups of coffee between them, in the careful way that June delivered things that required careful delivery. Mara listened to all of it without interrupting. June had the specific information that June had the parking structure, the conversation, the 7 minutes, and did not have details beyond that. She waited until June finished, and then she sat with the information for a moment, and she felt, moving through her in a current she couldn't entirely name, something that occupied the territory between relief and something more complicated. He went to him, she said. June looked at her. She thought about this. She thought about a man she'd known for perhaps 6 weeks, who came to a diner on a corner stool and ordered 1 coffee and tipped fair and never required a single thing of her that she hadn't chosen to give, going to a parking structure on a Friday morning on her behalf without telling her he was going. Did he tell you he was going to do that? June asked. No. Do you wish he had? Mara thought about it honestly. I don't know, she said. I think if he'd asked me, I might have told him not to. And I think that would have been the wrong answer. June looked at her coffee. Mara said, did he do it because she stopped? She started again. Is this because of the territory? Because Derek being here is a problem for how things run? June looked at her. She looked at her for long enough that it was its own answer before she said, you should ask him that. I should ask him that. I think you should. Mara thought about what the answer might be. She thought about the difference between the 2 possible answers and what each one would mean, what it would mean if it was purely strategic. If she was a problem in the neighborhood, he'd resolved in the most efficient way available. If the protection was operational and not personal. She thought about whether that would be enough. Whether she could take it on those terms, practical and bounded, and not need it to mean the other thing. She thought she could. She thought she was practical enough for that. She also thought, if she was being entirely honest, that she wasn't completely certain it would be enough. June refilled their cups. Outside on Callaway Street, the October evening was beginning. Lights coming on in buildings. The neighborhood settling into its nighttime character. And somewhere in the city, Roman Voss was moving through the system he'd built, and Derek Hollis was in a rental car making a decision, and Mara Callahan was sitting in a diner kitchen thinking about the specific difference between safety that was given and safety that was chosen, and whether she was brave enough, after everything, to recognize the second kind and reach for it. She didn't have the answer yet, but she was. She realized, sitting with her coffee and June's steady company and the familiar warmth of the kitchen around her, no longer afraid. Not of Derek. Not of what came next. Not of the specific vertigo of owing something to someone who had done something unrequested that she hadn't known to ask for. She was, for the first time in a very long time, simply thinking about tomorrow. Derek Hollis did not leave on Friday. Silas's update came through at 9, that evening. Subject still at Riverside Inn. No visible movement toward departure. No reservation change on file. Roman read the message in his car outside a meeting he'd just come from, sitting in the specific stillness of a man who had expected one outcome and was recalibrating for another. He'd spoken clearly. He'd been direct in the specific, terminal way that men in his territory understood as final. And Derek Hollis had sat in his rental car and heard every word and apparently decided that none of it applied to him. Roman had seen this before, the particular failure mode of men who had spent so long inside systems that protected them from consequence that they had lost the cognitive function that processed consequences real. They heard the warning and they translated it, automatically, through the only interpretive lens they had. Someone is bluffing, someone is posturing, someone is trying to scare me, and I do not scare. That was a catastrophic translation error. Roman had never bluffed in his operational life, and had built his entire reputation on the specific fact of that. He drove back to the waterfront. He didn't call Marco. Not yet. He sat at his desk, and he thought about the specific arithmetic of what came next, what was measured, what was proportional, what would achieve the necessary outcome without crossing into territory he had specific, internal restrictions about. He had those restrictions. He'd always had them. They were not for public consumption, not part of any narrative he'd built around himself. Simply the code that had been in him from before the Empire, the thing he'd decided about what kind of man he would and wouldn't be. Certain things were off the table always. He knew what they were. He stayed on the right side of them. What was available was enough. He called Silas. If he moves tonight, I want to know immediately. Then he went to bed and slept with the facility of a man who had made his decisions and was waiting for the situation to present the correct moment to execute them. Saturday came in with fog off the water, the kind that muffled the city's ambient noise into something almost gentle. Mara worked the morning shift and thought about June's advice you should ask him and thought about what asking meant, what it would cost, what kind of door it would open that she wasn't certain she knew how to close again. She was serving the couple in booth 3 when she saw him come in. Not Roman. The door opened at 7:16 on Saturday morning. Not Roman. Not a regular. Not any of the familiar shapes that had become the grammar of her mornings here. Derek. He didn't take a table. He stood just inside the door with his hands at his sides and his eyes on her, and the gray jacket buttoned against the cold outside. And his face had a different quality than it had on Thursday. The ease was gone, entirely, replaced by something more concentrated, more stripped down, the specific expression of a man who had run out of patience with the distance between what he wanted and what he was getting. She noticed, in the half-second before she did anything, the way the room registered his arrival. The couple in booth 3 went still without knowing they'd done it. The man at the counter set his fork down. The diner's ambient noise didn't stop. The kitchen was still going. The coffee machine was still running, but something in the human atmosphere of the room adjusted, recalibrated, the way a room does when the thing entering it carries a charge that everyone feels but nobody can entirely name. Mara set the plates down with complete steadiness. She stood up straight. She felt the room's atmosphere change in the specific way it changed when Derek was in it, the particular shift in air pressure that her body knew before her mind did. The old education of 3 years translating itself into current tense adrenaline in the space between one breath and the next. Mara, he said, I need to talk to you. You need to leave. Her voice was even. The restraining order, I don't care about the restraining order. He took a step toward her. I don't care about the man who spoke to me yesterday. None of that is real, Mara. What's real is that you're my ex-wife, she said. One word. The same word. The door she kept closing every time he tried to reopen it. He took another step. The room had gone quiet in the way rooms go quiet when something is happening that everyone can feel and no one knows how to stop. The couple in booth 3 were very still. The man at the counter had put down his fork. You're coming home, Derek said, and his voice had dropped into the register she remembered from the worst of it, low and certain. The voice of a man who decided a thing and now considered the deciding to be the entirety of what was required. You're done with this. With this city and this job and all of this. You're going to get your things, and she took a step back. Not away from him, toward the counter, toward the phone that Frank kept mounted beside the register. The specific geometry of positioning that changed what was available to her. Her heart was going fast, and her hands were at her sides, and they were not shaking. Frank appeared from the kitchen doorway. He didn't speak. He was simply there, all 6'4" of him, with the patient stillness of a man for whom the current situation was recognizable and the correct response already known. Derek looked at Frank. He looked at Mara. He looked at the room, the frozen couple, the man at the counter with his fork down, and something crossed his face that was partly rage and partly the specific frustration of a man who kept encountering the same obstacle in new forms, kept finding that the world had arranged itself against him in ways it had no right to. This isn't over, he said. He looked at Mara when he said it. Not at Frank, not at the room. At her. The specific 2-word communication of a man who intended to have the last word even when he was being made to leave, who needed her to know, as he went through the door, that the going was temporary and the decision still his. He left. The door closed. Mara stood at the counter and breathed. One breath in, one controlled breath out. The couple in booth 3 started eating again with the carefully normal concentration of people processing something. The man at the counter picked up his fork. Frank looked at Mara, and she nodded once, and he went back to the kitchen. June appeared at her elbow. She didn't say anything. She handed Mara a glass of water and stood close while Mara drank it, and they both looked at the door. Then Mara said, He said it isn't over. I know. June's voice was quiet. He's going to come back. I know that too. Mara set down the glass. She thought about the parking structure conversation, about Roman's specific words that June had relayed, she is under my protection, and she thought about Derek's face just now, The particular quality of a man who'd been warned and had decided the warning didn't apply to him. She thought about what that combination produced, and whether there was a version of what came next that didn't require something more than conversations and restraining orders and Frank appearing in the kitchen doorway. She said, "I need to call him." June looked at her. "Roman," Mara said, "I need to tell him what just happened." June reached under the counter and produced a business card that had been sitting there since, Mara estimated from the age of its edges, at least Thursday. She set it on the counter without comment. Mara looked at it. She picked it up. The number was handwritten in the kind of economical script that matched everything else about him: clean, minimal, nothing wasted. She went to the back and she called it. He picked up on the second ring. "He was here," she said, without preamble, without identifying herself, because it seemed unnecessary and he would know. "Just now." He said, "It isn't over." A brief silence. Not surprised processing, she thought. "Running something. Did he touch you?" "No." "Did he threaten you directly?" "He said I was coming home with him." "He said," she stopped, finding the specific words. "He said none of it is real. The order, the conversation you had with him." Roman said, "Are you still at work?" "Yes." "Stay there. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call. Mara stood in the back hallway with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she went back to her tables. He arrived in 19 minutes. She was aware of it before she saw him the door, the shift in the room's atmosphere that his presence produced, the particular quality of stillness that moved through a room when he entered it like a change in barometric pressure. She was at the window table when he came in, refilling the couple's water, and she turned to see him at the door, and their eyes met across the room, and she felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a name for and wasn't going to try to name right now. He sat at the corner stool. June brought his coffee without being asked. He looked at Mara with the specific directness she'd come to recognize as his version of check-in, not demanding anything, just taking the temperature, making sure she was still here and still intact and still herself. She finished the table and went to the counter. "He's not going to accept the conversation," she said quietly. "The one you had with him." "No," Roman said. "He's not." "So what happens now?" He looked at her. His expression was level and direct and contained something that she was starting, with the accumulated weight of weeks of data, to be able to read a specificity of attention that was not operational, not the attention he brought to territory management or information gathering, but something that had her name on it. He said, "I'm going to solve this." Just like that. "Yes." She looked at him. She thought about what solving it meant in the specific vocabulary of the world he operated in, and she thought about her own position on that, and she held it plainly for a moment before she said, "I don't need you to do something you'll have to clean up later because of me. I won't be cleaning anything up." "How do you know?" "Because I know what this requires and I know how to do it without crossing lines." He held her eyes steadily. "I have restrictions. Personal ones. I want you to know that." She thought about this. She thought about the specific meaning of a man like Roman Voss having personal restrictions and choosing to name them to her unprompted, choosing to give her the information that would let her locate him more accurately on the map she was building. "Okay," she said. He drank his coffee. She went to her next table. When she came back, 15 minutes later, he was still there, which was not his pattern. He had finished his coffee and had no operational reason to stay, and she recognized the staying for what it was. Not surveillance. Presence. The deliberate presence of someone who had decided that her shift did not end until she was safely somewhere else, and who had arranged his afternoon around that fact without making a point of it. She refilled his cup even though it didn't need it. He didn't comment on this either. At one point, around 11, she came to the counter between tables and stood there for a moment without a practical reason for standing there, just standing, and she said, in a voice that was quiet enough that only the space between them received it, "Why does it matter to you?" And she meant it the way June had meant it, not accusing, not pushing, just the plain question asked by a woman who had learned that plain questions were the only ones that got real answers. He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not evasion. Then he said, "Because it's wrong. What he's doing. Because I built something in this neighborhood, and what I built has a code in it, and the code says this specific thing is wrong, and I don't let wrong things continue in my territory when I can stop them." She heard all of that. She heard it carefully. "And," he said, and paused. And she knew from the pause that this next part cost him something, that he was not a man who said, and easily, that the word was a door he was opening against its natural resistance. "Because it's you." The diner held its usual noise around them. The sound of the kitchen, the couple discussing something by the window, a chair scraping. Ordinary things. And in the middle of all of it, those 3 words sitting between them like something solid. Mara looked at him. He looked back. He didn't take the words back, didn't soften them, didn't add anything to them that would dilute what they'd already said. Just held them plainly in the air. She thought about the 7 months. About learning not to need anyone. About the specific cost of that learning and the specific, terrifying possibility that some of what she'd learned might be worth unlearning if she could be certain of what she was trading it for. She wasn't certain. Not yet. She was still building the picture. But the end was in the picture now. It was data. Real, plain, directly given data from a man who communicated in precision and had just deployed the most precise thing available. She nodded once, and she went back to work. Roman left the Ember at 12:30 and drove to a building on the south end of his territory where a man named Callum kept an office on the 4th floor that served multiple purposes, the most relevant of which was that Callum had spent 22 years in and adjacent to law enforcement infrastructure across 3 states and understood, better than most people Roman knew, how systems worked and how they failed and what they could and couldn't do about men like Brian Hollis. Callum was 58, silver-haired, and had the specific quality of calm that came to people who had seen enough chaos to develop a personal relationship with its mechanics. He looked at the file Marco had assembled on Brian Hollis with the attentive patience of a man who read documents the way other people read music for the structure beneath the notation. The thing about men like this, Callum said, without looking up, is that they build institutional reach because they understand how to be useful to the right people at the right time. And that same reach is also, always, a record. Because the right people keep records. Roman waited. Callum turned a page. I know some people who know some things about Brian Hollis and a land development decision in Crestdale County about 6 years ago, and about where the money went that was supposed to go somewhere else. He looked up. If that information were to reach the right desk at the state attorney general's office, Brian Hollis would have considerably less appetite for personal trips to the city on his nephew's behalf. That's what I'm looking for, Roman said. Callum nodded. I'll make some calls. Nothing illegal, nothing that comes back to you. Just information finding its natural level. And Derek. Callum tilted his head. That depends on what Derek decides to do next. If he leaves, that's the end of it. If he escalates, he won't leave, Roman said. He's decided I'm not real. Callum smiled the thin smile of a man who had heard this before. Then he'll make a mistake. They always make a mistake when they decide the consequences aren't real. You just have to be positioned for it when it happens. It happened on Sunday. Roman was at his desk when Silas called at 6:48 in the morning, which was early even for Silas, and the flatness in his voice had a different quality than it had carried before. Not urgency exactly, but the specific density of information that was time-sensitive. He went to the boarding house, Silas said. 40 minutes ago. He tried to enter using a key card he had made from the room key he photographed when Mrs. Papadakis had it out on the counter during their conversation. The new lock stopped him. He tried twice, and then he stood in the hallway for approximately 4 minutes, and then he left the building. Roman was already standing. He'd been waiting for this escalation the way you wait for weather. You can feel building with the calm of someone who has made all the preparations available and is now simply waiting for the moment to use them. The new lock had held. That was the first fact, and it mattered. It was the thing that had bought the time he needed. But Derek Hollis had tried to use a fabricated key to enter a woman's room while she slept, which was a different category of action than standing on a sidewalk or sitting in a parking structure. It was a category that had no version of itself that was anything other than what it was. Where is he now? His car is still in the Riverside Inn lot. We have visual. I want to know the moment he moves. He called Marco next. I need Petra at the boarding house now. I need her inside if she can manage it. He took a breath. He tried to get into her room. Marco's voice went flat. Understood. On it. And call Callum. Tell him to move on the Hollis information today. Not tomorrow. Then Roman called Mara. She answered on the 3rd ring, voice alert in the way of someone who had been sleeping lightly, and came awake fast, the old watchfulness, still there beneath the 7 months of rebuilding. He heard her voice, and something in him, he kept in a separate room from all his operational thinking, registered the sound of it, the specific frequency of it, the way it was already braced for information and still managed to sound like itself underneath the bracing. He said, last night, between 6 and 7 a.m., This morning, Derek Hollis attempted to enter your room at the boarding house. A silence. He continued. The new lock held. He couldn't get in. He's gone now. He's not in the building. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, he had a key made. He photographed Mrs. Papadakis's key during their conversation. She processed this. He could hear her breathing, measured and controlled, the sound of someone running the arithmetic. After a moment, she said, I need to not be there today. Yes. Where do I go? Roman said, I have a place on the north side of the waterfront. It's secure. You'll be safe there until this is resolved. She said, Today? Today? Another silence. He heard her making the decision in real time, felt the weight of it in the quality of the quiet, the specific gravity of a woman choosing to enter the territory of a man she'd been building trust with for 6 weeks, when the alternative was a room with a lock that had just proven insufficient. She said, All right. He breathed once, slowly. Give me an hour, he said. I'll send someone to bring you. He sent Petra, who was already in the building. Petra was a small woman with a practical manner and an ability to move through spaces without creating the kind of attention that would signal to anyone watching that anything had changed. She brought Mara out through the building's back entrance at 8:15 with a bag containing the specific things Mara had apparently identified with the efficient economy of a woman who'd packed a bag in an emergency before and knew exactly what mattered and what didn't. Roman met them at the waterfront building. He saw her come through the door, and he looked at her face, and she looked at his, and for a moment neither of them said anything, because neither of them needed to. She was here. She was all right. The lock had held. The whole specific machinery of everything he'd put in place over 2 weeks had held for the one moment that actually mattered. She looked around the space, a clean, spare apartment on the building's top floor that he kept for operational needs, which now meant this specific need, her safety, which he acknowledged to himself was no longer operational in any sense that word usually carried. She said, when she'd done a circuit of the windows and checked both exits with the automatic competence of someone who always checked exits. Is it over? Not yet, he said. But today? She looked at him. She had the particular quality of someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and can feel the possibility of setting it down, but hasn't fully trusted the surface yet. He understood that. He'd waited for that trust to develop, and he intended to wait for as long as it required. What happens today, she said. He told her. Not everything, not the operational detail, not Callum's name or the specific mechanism of the Hollis information, but the architecture of it. That Derek would be made to understand his exposure in terms that penetrated where verbal warnings hadn't. That his uncle would receive information that made the cost of continued involvement prohibitive. That the specific immunity Derek had relied on his entire life was about to reveal itself as locally bounded. That it extended only as far as Crestdale and its institutional infrastructure and stopped entirely at the city limits. She listened with the complete attention she brought to everything. When he finished, she said, The information about the uncle. Is it real? It's real. We didn't manufacture it. We found it. She nodded. That matters, she said. And he understood that she was drawing a line in what she could accept and what she couldn't, and he respected it the same way he respected everything about her fully and without requiring her to move the line. I'll tell you when it's done, he said. She said, I'm going to make coffee if you have any. He showed her the kitchen. He went to his desk. Callum's contact at the State Attorney General's office received the Hollis file at 9:17 Sunday morning, which was unusual timing for a Sunday. The contact called Callum back at 9:51. Callum called Roman at 10:03. There's enough here to open a formal inquiry, Callum said. My contact is making a call to the Crestdale County seat this morning. Not official, yet that takes time, but Brian Hollis will know by noon that someone is looking. At noon, Brian Hollis called Derek. Silas had Derek's phone activity monitored through a mechanism that Roman did not ask about, and Silas did not explain. What Silas could report was the duration 11 minutes, and what he could infer from the call's aftermath. Derek Hollis checked out of the Riverside Inn at 12:47 and was observed loading his bags into the rental car at 12:55. Roman received this update at 1:03. He sat with it for a moment. Not relief exactly, more the specific resolution of a sustained tension, the particular quality of a situation that has been aimed correctly and has landed where it was directed. He got up from his desk and walked to the kitchen doorway. Mara was at the counter with a coffee and a library book she'd had in her bag. and she looked up when he appeared, and he saw the question in her face before he said anything. "It's done," he said. She held his eyes. "He's leaving. His uncle received information this morning that changes what continued involvement costs him. He called Derek, and Derek is checking out of his hotel." She said nothing for a moment. She looked down at her coffee and then back up at him with an expression that was doing several things simultaneously: relief, and something like disbelief, and something that looked, underneath both of those, like the specific quality of a person who has been bracing for impact for so long that the absence of it doesn't immediately read as safety. That has to be learned. That takes a moment to become real. She said, "Is he gone for good?" Roman thought about Brian Hollis and the state attorney general and the specific arithmetic of a man whose institutional protection had just developed a serious structural problem. He thought about Derek, alone in his rental car driving northeast, running the new numbers on what this city had cost him and what returning would cost him further. "Yes," he said. She looked at her coffee for a long moment. Then she put the book down and she looked at him and she said, "I want to ask you something." He indicated that she could. She said, "When you told him in the parking structure that she's under my protection, did you mean it as a territorial thing? Like a problem in the neighborhood that you were claiming ownership of?" He was quiet for a moment. He thought about the question and how to answer it precisely, the way he thought about everything that required precision. He said, "That's how I told myself I meant it. At the beginning. And now it means what the words say." The kitchen was quiet around them. The building was quiet. Outside the waterfront windows, the city was doing its Sunday morning things, ordinary, unhurried, indifferent to the specific thing that had just shifted in this room, the thing that had been building since a man turned on a corner stool and looked at another man and made a decision. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He was not performing patience. He had the real thing, the settled, structural patience of someone who understood that the right outcome sometimes required waiting for the right moment without intervention. Then she said, "I'm not the same as I was. I know that. 3 years changed me. And 7 months trying to change back." She held his eyes. "I'm not finished changing back. I know that too. So whatever this is," she said, and gestured slightly, meaning the room, the morning, the word, and meaning the whole accumulated weight of 6 weeks of corner stools and coffee and a man who turned on a stool on a Thursday morning. "Whatever this is has to go slowly. Not because I don't," she stopped. "Not because of anything about you. Because of what I learned about myself and what it costs me to trust something and what I need to do it right." He said, slowly. She looked at him. He said, "I have a table at the Italian place on Birch Street next Friday. 7 o'clock. It's not a performance, and it doesn't cost you anything, and if you decide between now and then that you'd rather not, you call me, and we don't go, and nothing changes." She was quiet. "That's as slow as you need it to be," he said. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, "I'll need to go back for the rest of my things." "At the boarding house?" "Yes. Mrs. Papadakis is going to have questions." He almost smiled. "I imagine she is. I'm going to tell her the truth." "Good." She picked up her coffee. She looked at the window and the waterfront beyond it, and then back at him with an expression. He was beginning to learn the specific vocabulary of the small increments of her trust made visible, the way she gave things carefully and meant them completely when she gave them. "Friday," she said. Friday. The week that followed was ordinary in all the ways that extraordinary things settle into ordinarity when they're resolved. Mara went back to the boarding house and retrieved her things and reassured Mrs. Papadakis, who had a great many questions and received honest answers to all of them, and then said, with the pragmatic wisdom of a woman who had run a boarding house for 19 years, "Good, good," and offered Mara the marmalade from the third shelf, which was unprecedented. She worked her shifts at the Ember. The window checking stopped. Not because she made a conscious decision to stop, because there was simply nothing to check for, no threat shaping itself in the periphery, no reason to spend the attention. June noticed on the second day and said nothing, which was its own commentary. Roman came to his stool on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday, at his usual time, and ordered his coffee, and they talked not about what had happened or what was coming, but about ordinary things. The book she was reading. The physics of why the diner's front door stuck in cold weather. Whether the city was better in fall or spring, a question on which they turned out to hold opposing views, which produced a brief, unexpected exchange that ended with something on her face he was still thinking about on Thursday night. He was not a man given to thinking about things he wasn't sure of. He preferred the clean architecture of certainty. But she had introduced a category of uncertainty into his internal landscape that didn't have its usual quality of unresolved problem. It was more like the uncertainty of something in the process of becoming clear, the specific suspense before a picture develops, when you can feel the shape of it without yet seeing it fully. He thought about that on Thursday night, and he thought about Friday, and he thought about going slowly, and what slowly meant to a man who had built his entire life on the principle of moving through the world with precision and intent. Going slowly, he thought, was not the absence of intent. It was intent applied differently towards something that required a different quality of patience than the operational kind, a patience that was not strategic but genuine, not the waiting for the right moment patience of territory management, but the patience of a man who understood that what was growing between them was real, and real things required real time. He went to bed and slept, and did not overthink it further. Friday was cold and clear, the kind of October evening that smelled like leaves and coming winter, the air sharp enough that Mara's breath showed when she walked from Mrs. Papadakis's building to the corner where Roman had said he'd meet her. She'd worn the dark green coat she'd bought with her first month's tips, the one June had called distinguished and Frank had called nice coat in the gruff, compressed way Frank communicated approval. She'd stood in front of the mirror before leaving and looked at herself for a moment. She looked like herself. That was the thing she noticed. Not the version of herself she'd been with Derek, the careful, diminished version that had learned to occupy the minimum necessary space and call it love. Not the 7-month version, still flinching at loud sounds and checking windows and building her walls with the frantic efficiency of someone who didn't know when the next attack was coming. Just herself, Mara Callahan, 31, green coat, $412 in a savings account that had quietly become $680 since June had given her the Saturday morning shift, standing in a boarding house room with a window that locked from the inside, on her way to dinner. She'd looked at herself and she'd thought, still here. She'd thought, still me. Roman was already at the corner when she arrived. He was wearing a dark coat, and he looked exactly like himself. No performance, no calibration, just the specific quality of a man who moved through the world with complete comfort in his own dimensions. He looked at her when she came around the corner, and something in his expression changed very slightly in the way she'd learned to read by now, the fractional softening at the corners, the specific temperature shift. He said, "You came." She said, "I said I would." He said nothing further. They walked. The Italian place on Birch Street was warm and lit with the amber light that good restaurants deploy to make everyone inside look like they were in a painting of an evening out. They were seated at a table in the corner. She noted the corner with a small internal acknowledgement of the instinct, and then let it go, because the instinct said check your exits, and she'd checked them, and they were fine, and she was allowed to put that down now. They ordered red wine, pasta, the bread that came with a small dish of good olive oil, and which Roman ate with the unself-conscious pleasure of someone who genuinely liked the thing they were eating, which was such a specific, ordinary quality that she found it unexpectedly reassuring. She'd thought about this dinner more than she'd meant to, had thought about it in the particular sideways manner she had with things she wasn't ready to examine, directly registering it peripherally, letting it exist at the edge of her attention without bringing it to the center where it would require her to have a position on it. She'd told herself it was practical, that she was going because the week had been what it had been, and because the man across from her had earned a conversation at minimum, and because June would ask, and she wanted to be able to answer honestly. She'd believed that up until she was standing in front of the mirror in her green coat and realized she'd been thinking about what to say for 4 days. They talked. They'd been building a vocabulary for months, the accumulated small exchanges at the counter, the specific way she'd learned the shape of his sentences, the direct and economic quality of them, nothing ornamental, nothing deployed for effect. She'd come to trust the directness of it. She'd spent 3 years with a man who wrapped everything in reasonableness until it was unrecognizable, and Roman Voss did not wrap things. He didn't dress things up or ease into them or position them for best reception. He said what was accurate, and he let it be what it was. She'd been starving for that quality of speech without knowing it. She told him about Crestdale. Not all of it, there was too much of it for one dinner, and some of it she didn't have words for yet, and some of it she did, but wasn't ready but enough. Enough to give him the actual picture rather than the outline. The way it had started, the gradual quality of it, the specific thing that happened to a person who was eroded slowly over time rather than broken suddenly, how you didn't notice until you went to reach for something in yourself and found it wasn't there anymore. He listened with the full quality of his attention, which was one of the things she'd come to value most about him, the fact that listening was something he did completely, without the portion of attention kept in reserve for formulating his own response, without the impatience that showed in people for whom listening was a waiting room they were tolerating before they could speak. When she finished, he said, "You noticed, though?" Eventually, she said, "I noticed because I left. I think if I'd stayed I might have not noticed until there was nothing left to notice with." He held her eyes. "You didn't stay?" "I didn't stay." He picked up his wine. She watched him think about something, the specific quality of a man deciding whether to say a thing. He said, "I've spent 20 years building something that operates on fear. It works. It has its logic." He paused. "But it also produces a version of myself that I bring everywhere. And there are rooms I stopped being able to go into because the version of me that I built can't fit through the door." She looked at him. He said, "You're one of the rooms I couldn't go into." For a while, she held this. He said, "I notice things in this neighborhood. I've always noticed them. But I don't usually." He stopped, found the exact word. "Engage." She said, "Why me?" He said, without any hesitation, because he'd already decided he was going to answer this honestly. "Because you were managing something impossible with complete dignity, and nobody was helping you, and something in me that I'd stopped listening to for a long time decided it was paying attention again." She thought about that. She thought about the specific, careful thing it was for a man to name that, to say, "I stopped listening to something in myself, and then it started again," to say it plainly, without making it her responsibility to manage. She said, "I'm not going to be managed." He said, "I know." She said, "And I'm not going to be protected in the way that means owned." "If that's what this is, it's not," he said. The certainty was complete and clean, no hesitation in it. "Protection is not possession. I know the difference." She thought about what she'd been building for 7 months, the small, sturdy structure of her own life, the savings account, and the room with the locking window, and June's laugh, and the specific feeling of carrying her own weight without needing anyone to carry it with her. She thought about what it would cost to add someone to that structure, what it would require in terms of the walls she'd been building, which would have to become something else, not walls, but something more like windows. Operable windows. The kind you could open when the weather was right and close when it wasn't. She thought about what it would mean to trust the specific man across the table from her, who had turned on a stool and looked at Derek and then had proceeded, quietly and without fanfare, to become the most consistent and unbargaining presence in her rebuilt life, asking for nothing she hadn't offered, claiming nothing she hadn't given. She thought, data. She ran the data. The data said, yes. Not yes easily, and not yes without conditions, and not yes in the way of someone who had abandoned their own judgment in favor of someone else's safety. Yes with her eyes open. Yes with the full awareness of who he was and what he'd built and what it meant to be in proximity to it. Yes, because she had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was sound. She said, "This has to be something real." He looked at her. She said, "I'm not available for the other kind. I spent 3 years with the other kind dressed up as something real, and I know the difference now in my bones, and I won't do it again." He said, "This is real." 2 words. The same weight and directness as every other thing he'd said, which was precisely why she believed them. She said, "Okay." He said, "Okay." They finished dinner. They walked back through the October night, the cold, clean air and the city lights and the specific sounds of a Friday evening laughter from a bar they passed, a cab horn, 2 people in a heated discussion about something that seemed very important to both of them. Ordinary sounds. The city going about its life. At the corner nearest her building, he stopped, and she stopped beside him, and they stood for a moment in the kind of quiet that had its own texture. That was not the absence of words, but the presence of something words would have interrupted. He said, "Thank you for coming." She looked at him in the amber spill of the nearest streetlight, and she thought about everything it had taken to arrive at this specific intersection, the duffel bag in the dark at 4 in the morning, the 240 miles, the 90 days at the shelter, the room with the locking window, 7 months of building, and 1 Thursday morning of plate glass and a gray jacket, and a smile she'd had to learn not to be afraid of anymore, and she thought about all of it leading, through the specific chain of events and decisions and small accumulated moments of choosing herself to here. This corner. This man. This particular quality of evening. She said, I'll see you at the counter on Monday. He said, Tuesday. I have business Monday. She said, then Tuesday. She went inside. She climbed to her floor. She went into her room, and she took off her coat, and she sat on the edge of her bed, and she looked at the window locked from the inside. Operable. The kind you could open when the weather was right, and she felt the specific quality of the evening settle into her bones the way good things settle when you stop bracing against them. She thought about all the versions of herself she'd been in the last 4 years. The one who'd said yes at an altar in Crestdale with her whole heart and no map. The one who'd packed a bag in the dark with nothing but her own name reclaimed and 240 miles of highway ahead. The one who'd walked into a diner on a rainy Wednesday and been handed a uniform and a chance. The one who'd stood at a counter with a carafe in each hand and not checked the window. All of those women were still her. All of them were in the room right now, sitting on this bed, in this coat, in this city that had become hers by the quiet, daily act of choosing it. She lay back and looked at the ceiling. Still here. Still her. Something new, now too. Something she didn't have a full name for yet. But it was in the room with her, and it was warm, and it was hers, and she had chosen it with open eyes. That was enough. That was everything. This is what I want you to take with you from Mara Callahan's story. Not the part where someone else solved her problem, because that's not what happened. What happened is that a woman who had survived 3 years of systematic erosion rebuilt herself with patient, unglamorous work, 1 shift, 1 month's rent, 1 locking window at a time, and when danger followed her into the life she'd built, she did not collapse. She breathed. She stood. Her hands did not shake. She called for backup when backup was needed, and she let herself receive what was offered, and she never once confused being supported with being owned. The difference between those two things is everything. She knew it. She'd learned it in the worst possible classroom, and she carried the knowledge like something she'd earned rather than something that had happened to her, because that is what strong women do. They metabolize the thing that tried to destroy them into the exact ingredient they need to survive what comes next. What happened is that a man who had built a kingdom on the principle of impenetrability found, at the corner stool of a diner on a gray Tuesday morning, something that penetrated anyway. Not because she tried to reach him, because she didn't. Because she was entirely, completely herself, her dignity intact, her intelligence undiminished, her refusal to perform or manage or become interesting to him, an act of such genuine self-possession that it got past every wall he'd ever built, not through the door, but through the specific crack that opens in a thing when it finally encounters something real. He saw her, not the version of her that would have been useful to him, not the version that was in distress and therefore comprehensible in the category of problems he knew how to solve. He saw the actual woman, her efficiency and her window checking and her glass of water steadiness in the moment when the man who'd spent 3 years teaching her to be small walked through her door and found out that small was not what she'd become. He saw her, and he decided something. And the decision cost him nothing except the very specific wall between the version of himself he'd built for 20 years and the version of himself that had been waiting patient, unchanged, quietly alive behind it. There's a particular thing that happens to people who are cared for the right way after being cared for the wrong way. The walls don't come down, not all at once, not without reason, but a door appears in them that wasn't there before. A door with a lock that only opens from the inside. Mara Callahan found that door in herself on a Friday evening on a street corner lit amber by an ordinary streetlight, and she did the bravest thing a woman who has survived what she survived can do. She reached for the handle. She decided, with full knowledge and open eyes, to open it. Not because she needed saving. She'd already saved herself. Because she wanted to let someone in. What Mara Callahan learned, in 7 months and 6 weeks and 1 October Friday on a street corner in a city she'd made her own, that safety was not the absence of danger. That it was something you built from the inside out. That you could accept help without surrendering yourself to it. That the people who loved you into smallness were not loving you at all. And that the ones who made room for your full size, who met you at your actual dimensions and did not require adjustment, were the only ones worth the risk of opening the window for. She opened the window. She is still Mara Callahan. Still the woman who drives 240 miles in the dark when she has to. Still the woman whose hands don't shake when everything else does. She is also the woman who took a corner stool seriously, who ran the data and trusted the data and made the only decision the data supported, who chose, with open eyes and both hands, the specific version of her future that required the most courage to reach for. She is, in every way that matters, still here, still her, and she is no longer alone. Thank you so much for staying until the end. If this story stayed with you, the videos on your screen right now were made for you. I think you'll love them. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.